My name is Stefan Cholovich, and today we are going to talk about cap tables. Now, before I begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing on my website, stefancholovich.com. Over the past couple years, I've written about different topics that I've come across throughout my professional career, and they really deal with the space where finance, tech, and startups meet. Now what I'd like to do is take the articles that receive the most interest from people like you and discuss them in a bit more depth over video and do some tutorials on Excel as well. Without further ado, our first topic is cap tables. Today, we're going to cover what is a cap table and what does it look like in its most simple form, and two, how can a cap table be used? All of that and more right now in Excel.
All right, folks, here it is. And let's look into the most simple question, what is a cap table? Well, a cap table shows the equity capitalization of a company, which ultimately says who owns this company today. That includes founders, employees, and external investors. But not only will you see the ownership today, you'll see who has a future right to ownership, which ultimately could include stock options, stock warrants, and a few other securities too, but let's keep it simple for now. Looking at the left side of the table, you'll see that we have two founders who both have 275,000 shares of common stock each. And I quickly want to note that they don't have preferred shares, nor does anybody else on this simple cap table. And that's because preferred shares are typically reserved for sophisticated external investors, which include both angels and VCs. And we'll get into that later. But for now, our founder and employees all have common stock. Now, as is the case with most companies, the founders couldn't do it alone, so as you see, they had to hire a couple employees. In this example, it's 3. Now, as an early stage company, they probably didn't have a lot of cash to offer these folks, so they had to give equity in the company. Now, in the case of employee 1, they have 150,000 shares of common stock, but they also have common options. And as we talked about, that doesn't necessarily give them ownership today, but if they do like to pay the company at some point in the future to exercise these options, they would be eligible to receive an additional 10,000 shares. And that's really what this fully diluted column here means, is what's your ownership in the company today, and then how many options could you theoretically exercise to give you your maximum potential ownership given your current employment contract. And here for employee 1, that's 160,000 fully diluted shares, which ultimately gives them a fully diluted ownership percentage of 16%. And that's just as simple as what's your fully diluted amount of shares divided by the fully diluted amount of stock currently in the company, which also includes the option pool, which I'll get to in just a second. And quickly, as you're building this cap table, this bottom part here, on a fully diluted basis, this percentage needs to be 100%. So if it's not, you obviously messed something up and you should go recheck your work. The situation is the exact same as employee number 1. They each have common stock, they each have common options, and to get to their fully diluted amount, it's just simply the common stock plus the common options. And in the case of fully diluted ownership, the operation works the same, where it's fully diluted shares divided by fully diluted total shares in the company, which here is a nice and even 1 million. Now, the one kind of quirk in this pre-investment cap table was the pre-investment option pool. And think of that as a well that we're going to slowly run dry as we start to hire more employees. So if we get employee number 4, the eventual common options that get awarded to them are going to come out of this well. So for example, if employee number 4 also gets 10,000 common options, this pre-investment option pool will be brought down to 90,000 shares. And it's not really a big deal now, but once this well does run dry, there's a whole corporate process around actually allowing more options to be issued to your employees. So just keep that in mind to make sure you have enough in that option pool before you get to that step. And here at the bottom, for marker number 5, we have our cap table summary. Now, you might be thinking, what's the point of having a summary? Well, really there isn't one because our cap table is incredibly simple and only has about 10 rows. But you can imagine that as this company continues to grow, gets hundreds of employees, and has dozens of investors, cap tables tend to get very hairy. So what we can do is build a cap table summary that really shows the ownership in the company in a much more simplified manner, where we could really total up the founders, the employees, the option pool, and then probably have one line for each round of investors too. That way we can see total ownership owned by Series A investors, Series B, and so forth. So it's a really nice way to start it early, and then we'll just keep updating it as we go. Now really, folks, that's it for understanding a cap table and what is it in its most simplified form. But let's quickly go back to one of those original questions that was, how can a cap table be used? And this is something that people don't talk about very frequently. And I want to let you know that a cap table is not also going to show you what the ownership today, but it's also a planning tool. For example, when these two founders started their company, they knew that they owned it 50-50. And at that point, it was still 275,000 shares each. But over time, they had to think about, okay, how much do we get diluted? As in, how much ownership do we lose when we start to add our first 3 employees? And you'll notice that that means rather than the company being 50-50, they went down to each having 27.5% of the company. Now, as a planning tool, what they could have done is said, okay, do you think employee number 1 would have only taken 50,000 shares of common stock? Let's see what that will look like. You simply just punch it in, and look at that. All of a sudden, we each have 30% of the company. If we did that for the rest of the employees and brought it down here, look at this. Now we each own a third of the company. So it's just used as a planning tool, and you can kind of get as creative with it as you want, but it's something to keep in mind, and it's another way to use a cap table.
And lastly, folks, just know that the amount of common stock and options shown on this page are not supposed to represent market compensation rates. So that means the number of common stock giving to employee number 1 as compared to the founders, these aren't market rates. I really want this to stand the test of time, so these numbers are pretty much arbitrary and are just nice and round for this example.
Nice and easy, right? Once you have that down, we'll move on to part 2 of the series, where our startup is going to receive its first external investment in the form of a convertible note from angel investors. And lastly, guys, do let me know if you're finding these videos helpful and how I can change them to make them work better for you, whether that's adjusting the format or even covering new topics. Take care.